start? I think social policy is such a big and important area of consideration. I've spent the last few months tuning into the electioneering in the United States. My favorite candidate is Bernie. Are you all following the elections? And the reason I'm fascinated by Bernie is because for the first time, I'm hearing a leading politician who understands what social policy is all about and makes the linkages between education, the history of people, the social and economic circumstances of groups, and why some groups are so unequally served and some are so disadvantaged and not making any progress. And there are many messages in his campaign that are relevant to us in Trinidad. So when I stand here, I said, where do I start? Where do I start? I stand here having worked as a medical social worker since 1963. I got a scholarship in 1960, a development scholarship. And I was told, I applied for a scholarship to do what was called in those days arming. Have you ever heard that word, arming? Never heard it, and you all are. Arming comes from almsgiving. You understand? And 60 years ago, there were about, more than 60 years, there might have been about 3 or 4 people who were working in the hospitals in Port of Spain in particular, called almoners. 2 of them, or 3 of them, no. Eventually, if there were 5 by the time I got there, 3 of them were English ladies. They came from a tradition of almsgiving that came right out of the ancient history of social policy in Britain, coming out of the history of church intervention, where the churches worked out a system to assist the most needy. And the almoners were involved in determining who were the most deserving of the poor. So there's a whole heaping set of stuff that one would have to address if one were to really do justice to the subject that I want to talk about. All I can say that in the more than 50 years of working as a social worker, I moved from medical social work at San Fernando Hospital, which was a very comprehensive response to people who had problems of all kinds, family problems, psychological problems, needs, practical needs, who were referred to the social workers in the hospital by the doctors. And the social workers were they were mostly ladies in the first, so Girl Fridays. You respond at several levels. You respond at the level of concerns for the survival of families, the emotional needs of patients and families, putting them in touch with resources in the community. Much of that work took us as medical social workers, not only to government agency, the social welfare was just social welfare funds for, if you were sick for a long time and the doctor gave you a recommendation for financial help, then you go to the medical social worker and the medical social worker refers you to social welfare and you get a predictable amount of money, and you know what social welfare is now. But we work between those. We worked. Yeah. Sorry? No, I'll stand because. Oh, I have to hold it here. Sorry. I certainly didn't come expecting this formal arrangement, so sorry about that. What I'm saying is that we responded to everything. Social problems, medical problems, problems of children having to go abroad for surgery. And for many years, I responded and saw the evolution of these social agencies in Trinidad and in San Fernando. So that when in 1922, 21, I remember when I was a little girl, not that early, but when I was selling these poppies on as little girls, we went around selling these for the coterie social workers. And so I knew who Audrey Jeffers was at the time. I'm saying that a lot has happened since that time, and there are now hundreds of non-governmental organizations in Trinidad. So many that I've lost track of them now, probably about more than 700 I know. And the evolution, and there hasn't been an evolution from charity, the idea of charity, feeding the poor. Much of the work, early work, inspired by religious organizations, included looking after the most indigent, looking after the children, like the children's homes, St. Dominic's, St. Michael's, providing for the elderly, St. Vincent de Paul. And many of them inspired by religious organizations. I don't know too much about the Hindus and Muslims agencies that may have existed in the South. But as we went along, as needs were identified, usually by special interest groups, services were created. So that when you think of when did the School for the Deaf start? Who started it? You would check that there were parents of deaf children. When there was the need for retarded children who were then so what we call now intellectually challenged children, but retarded home for retarded children, again started by the nuns. Later on, when there was need for a response to battered women, and that came quite late in the 60s while I was a young social worker, people whose mothers or mother-in-laws or what had been battered got together, businesswomen, and formed an organization. The first one that I knew about in San Fernando was a Business and Women's Club. A business and professional women's club started the first home for battered women in San Fernando somewhere in the late 60s, I think. So when in my office as a medical social worker, there were I think it was around 1960, there was an epidemic of German measles, and many babies were born deaf, some also with complications with heart conditions. The doctors at that time were recommending that children be given hearing aids. In those days, the hearing aids were the size of the cell phones. And the children had to have ear molds custom made to fit their ears. And after an epidemic, I found myself in San Fernando Hospital with a referral. In the first instance, I thought it was about 20 children. I knew nothing about deafness and about hearing aids, so I called in the teachers from the school for the deaf. And as a result of that, outside my office on a Saturday morning, we worked on Saturdays, these two teachers, Mr. Pedro and Miss Catherine Donaldson, she's now dead, both of them are now dead, came and met with the parents and taught them how to educate, how to stimulate their deaf children, while we arranged to get the funding to provide these children with ear molds and hearing aids and so on. And by the time the children were 3 years and 4 years, the parents began to panic. Where are they going to go to school? And out of that, because the parents had been associating with each other, for those years outside my office, we started negotiating, and one of the leading activists in San Fernando, Dr. Gunnis, he joined the Association in Aid of the Deaf, and they donated a house in San Fernando, which subsequently became the School for the Deaf, and the parents were involved in raising funds and the starting of that organization, which eventually was taken over by the government and became the first school for the deaf in the South. What I'm saying is that the non-governmental organizations emerged in response to identified needs. I went away in the 70s and did a master's degree in population communications. Was focused on family planning issues. I came back and returned to San Fernando and continued my work. And we were responding to, as professional social workers, responding to other issues. For instance, young mothers who who were expecting babies, they were unmarried, they had no support, didn't know whether they would keep their babies or not. And so a group of us medical social workers, but also psychiatric social workers and welfare officers and community police, and a whole group of us formed a committee. We called it the South Social Workers Task Force. And we started talking about catering for the needs of these babies whose mothers weren't sure they could take them. And so out of that, we experimented with foster care. And, well, that led to a whole lobby. But up to now, foster care isn't well established in this country. But it started by professional social workers being concerned about what to do, how to help mothers who are not able to take their babies and not sure they want to give them up for adoption, but at that time had nowhere to go with them. I'm giving you the chronology of my career because over time, services that we tried to respond to were taken up by voluntary organizations. One such service was the community chest, which you might have heard about. When I was working in San Fernando, in Port of Spain, there was a lady called May Cherry, who was one of the very distinguished and committed social workers. And as fast as the doctors referred children with heart conditions for treatment abroad, she, without knowing where the money was coming from, was negotiating with doctors in hospitals in Canada and wherever to take these children, finding the money, begging funding organizations and family members to accommodate some of these mothers and their children in Canada, and getting the hospitals to write off the cost of treatment of patients abroad. So when we hear the discussion about the Children's Fund today, know that a service was existing a long time ago. Thank you. And what I'm going to stop there, but to say that it is hard to talk in 15 minutes about the evolution of a service. When I came to near the end of my career as a medical, I did some work, research in child abuse, and out of that came a committee that ultimately created the direction for people who are the board, who are the fundraisers, and you get the specialists who are the trainers, and you hold it all together. I cannot tell you that story. It has been a marvelous story of searching for curriculum, developing a participatory methodology, and sharing that methodology. The best achievement I can account for is the collaboration we had with the Toko Foundation, which resulted in grassroots people in the community being trained to go into homes, visit mothers, and to support them in their parenting effort, and to train young men called gatekeepers to go into the community and do work with families in the community as well. I'm going to stop there because hopefully you get sense of what I've said, it is too much of a story to be told in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bishop. Now we would have Mr. Josh Drayton, who would give us his presentation.
So this is quite interesting for me. I've learned quite a bit about the history of civil society in Trinidad and Tobago. This is almost like a crash course in CSO history. My perspective is from probably a different side of the fence, both as an academic researcher in civil society affairs and issues, but also as a board member for a few years in two relatively prominent civil society organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, and that's Transparency and Veneer Pond. One of the key things I recognized that was being mentioned throughout the entire panel, at least two presenters so far, was the use of the term NGO, which I think I should address from the get-go. And why in my bio I use the term non-profits. And that's something that we have to recognize, that when we speak about NGOs, they belong to a larger part of another group, or a larger group, or umbrella kind of cluster or sector, and that's called civil society. Civil society, in a very simple way, has been defined as those not belonging to the state, but mediating between the state and the economy in some definitions. And that's one of the reasons why they're called the third sector in some of the more traditional literature. So I'll start there, because we recognize what the state is supposed to do in terms of politics, policy, legislation, managing the economy. And on the other side, we recognize what the business sector is supposed to do, which is being able to offer particular services primarily on a competitive basis, and that hopefully is supposed to be to the benefit of consumers. And therefore, there's this group that's caught in the middle trying to say that we're not about politics, directly, I should say, and I'll get to that. And there's this group, the same group that's saying, well, we're not for profit. We're about social development in some instances, but primarily development on the whole, whether you interpret development as economic, political, social, even human development. So that's where I'll start in terms of defining civil society, because it's important that we look at concepts. So NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are part of civil society, and it's quite interesting when we look at our context in Trinidad and Tobago, which I'm going to address briefly. Civil society came out of a number of movements, whether it's locally or, of course, internationally, where there are deficits in development, where governments were given money to develop their societies, and they wasted it. That's the truth. Jump high, jump low. And it's expressed in a number of places in the literature, if you read up a bit more on civil society. So therefore, to achieve this kind of development, donor agencies, coming to the funding thing, donor agencies decided that, and this is globally, that they would fund local organizing groups in order to achieve some kind of development, whether it's in the area of poverty alleviation, healthcare, and most of you are familiar with some of these sectors. What I want to address in coming into that is civil society organizations and policy making. And I want to say that there are different types of CSOs. And when I speak of CSOs, I'm speaking about non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, umbrella-type associations, charitable organizations, and the list can go on. Even trade unions are included in this very broad definition, academic, public academic universities. So that being said, civil society has or plays as a cluster or even as individual organization different roles within our society. Some is about empowerment. And you've heard some stories about empowering, whether it's in parenting or whether it's in lifting women up. There's also that role of public education that civil society organizations play. Educating the public about sexual practices, for example, or sexual and reproductive health, just to name one area. Civil society also does another, or has another functional role in the society, and that's monitoring government and private sector activities. And it's something that we have to a less extent here in Trinidad, but there are a number of examples internationally that we can speak of. And some of you are familiar with some of these other organizations within Trinidad that would monitor environmental issues, that would monitor issues related to public participation, democracy, human rights, and that's also a part of civil society. And social development, because when we speak about development, we recognize that these silos between, or the relationship rather, that exists between economic development and the interpretation of economic development by the state and how people develop, we have to bridge that gap. So there is a relationship between economic development and social development that has to be done through monitoring government policy. But the major one that we all are familiar with is advocacy. And advocacy, in very simple terms, is really getting the attention of government. And we've heard some examples about the school feeding program as a major thing, or even in your experience, how governments, perhaps who weren't aware, become aware of these national issues and social issues, and therefore incorporate that into their policy and their legislation. So that's important in terms of policy making. So let's probably go a bit more into, that's the role of civil society. I'm trying to cover a number of bases, so using this, and I recognize, Dr. Cambridge is very strict on time. So let's look at Trinidad and Tobago and civil society. And I'm using this term civil society because there are certain issues that are specific to some organizations more than others. I guess the number one issue for civil society is what you referred to, Joan, which is funding. And why is funding such a major issue? We're here in this building, lights, electricity, staff. In some instances, there are organizations who may have to rent a space, pay staff, or even if they have no building, no staff, so no utilities or operational expenses, they're involved in programmatic activities. And programmatic activities mean that they're involved in some kind of activity in the community, or they're involved in some other kind of activity. And there's a value, a dollar value to that. And because there's a dollar value to that, you have to get funding. Depending on what level of civil society organization you are, you may be able to attract some kind of funding, or you may not be able to attract some kind of funding. And let me speak about that. So if you're registered as a charity, let's talk about something that's very specific, that in fact speaks to what a number of civil society groups have started to do over the last year and a half in Trinidad and Tobago. And that is on the legal and fiscal framework. Yeah, big economic terms, but basically what that means is the issue of taxation. If you're registered as a non-profit in the Ministry of Legal Affairs, to start with, you actually fall under the same requirements or similar requirements of the Companies Act. All right, so, okay, technical jargon, legal jargon, but what does that mean? Well, in that particular act, you are required to pay corporation tax on profits. What does that mean? Well, after you've covered all of your expenses and you have some money remaining, you have to pay tax that is at a 25% of that, whatever that amount is. All right, so if, for example, you have $100, you have to pay $25 in a very simple way. Now, why is that a problem? Well, you're not a for-profit. So you don't have profits per se. You have money that goes back into your operational expenses to be used at a later date. But let's think about something even more peculiar. What if you receive money from a funder and your financial year runs as a calendar year, January 1st, December 31st, and that funder says, we're giving you money on the 25th, because it's Christmas, the 25th of December, for projects in the next year. Well, your financial year ends December 31st. So you have some extra money there to be used when? Next year. And in some instances, you have to pay tax on that amount, depending on how your audit is done. Back on the audit. In order to access international funding, so you're registered at Legal Affairs as a non-profit, and you go to Legal Affairs, you have all your stuff, you have your directors, etc., and there's a requirement. The requirement means that you must have audited financial statements. Cool, not a problem. Here's where the problem is. You want to access international funding from a number of donor agencies, whether it's UNDP or EU or any of these groups, international donor agencies. They would require certain kinds of information, sometimes 3 consecutive years of audited financial statements. So you must pay for an audit. Well, do you know what's the cost of an audit? Upwards of $10,000 unless you get someone to volunteer. You know, understand the issue? Yeah, this is where we get to the very practical component, because if you are a non-profit registered with Legal Affairs, you have this. Oh, by the way, you also have to pay Green Fund Levy, which, by the way, was meant to fund civil society organizations. But as a CSO, you pay for that. So I'm just talking about the legal and fiscal framework and the environment in which NGOs function. If you are, let's say, a CBO or community-based organization, you can access funding from the Ministry of Community Development, or in Tobago, the Division of Community Development, and you're given some money, but the requirements aren't as stringent in terms of getting audited financial statements. Because you'll be given $50,000, and in some instances, you don't. Thank you. See why it's difficult, as you said, in 15 minutes. So that's the legal and fiscal framework. There's a lot more other information I can give you, but I really want to read something here that is a part of some more recent research that I'm doing right now. And this is on open government partnership. The government of Trinidad and Tobago signed on to something, an initiative, international initiative called OGP. And they committed to this whole area of governance and the establishment of a civil society board. But in developing that commitment, they had to speak about the status quo. And I think this sums up how civil society is in Trinidad and Tobago. Not monolithic, of course. It's not civil society. It's different organizations competing. So I'll just read this quickly. And this is the status quo. This is really how civil society is viewed. Civil society shows weak organizational capacity, but at the same time, there is an increasing demand from the public to be included in policy development processes. There is a lack of mechanisms that involve civil society organizations on a regular and meaningful way in order to receive feedback during the public policy development process. Civil society and public policy, big gap, all right, because we're not very well organized. It's been estimated, the uppermost estimate has been 7,000 civil society organizations operating in Trinidad and Tobago. 7,000. This is the guy from the EU that did this survey a few years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago. That's how many. In the area of HIV and AIDS alone, there are over 100. All right, and they're registered in different places. So don't think you can just find the registration in legal affairs, because they're registered under community development and different areas, and they don't all have the same requirements. So some may have a constitution, but no audited financial, some may not have a very strict board structure, and there are so many other issues. But the point that I'm getting at in all of this is if we are to achieve some kind of development, whether it's social or human development and policy making, we have to move strategically away from heart activity, which traditionally civil society has been defined as, but heart and head, which means there's a particular process that has to be included and address issues of sustainability and governance. So given that I didn't get that 1 minute as yet, all right, so I'll stop here. You don't have to give me that 1 minute. I got a 3-minute marker. All right, so that's it. So if you have any other questions, I will be able to address. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, each of our panelists here. So let's give them all a round of applause. Okay, now we will have our 20-minute discussion and questions. So anyone in the audience, if you have any questions for anyone of these panelists.
Hi, I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Drayton. You were talking about non-profits and the sort of issues they go through when they're registered as non-profits, when NGOs are registered as non-profits. Can you tell me about when they're registered as a charity instead?
As a charitable organization, you're exempt from tax. So that's one of the key benefits, and coterie is one of. Coterie is registered as a charitable organization. So that's one of the key benefits. And let me explain why it's a major benefit. It means that whatever money you receive from fundraising activities, from grants, from donors, you're able to use. And that's one of the major benefits as a charitable organization. However, the challenge is in the registration. Sometimes it would take you upwards of 3 years to become fully registered as a there are specific sectors that can be registered as. So that if, for example, you're an organization, let's say like transparency, and you're involved in anti-corruption work, which influences social development and rights issues, etc., it's not directly associated to women's issues or children or health, and therefore the process will take a bit. That's one of the major benefits, along with the private sector funding you.
Hi, good day. This is directed to both Ms. Thompson and Ms. Joseph. Ms. Bishop, sorry. How do you monitor and evaluate your progress and contributions to the development of Trinidad and Tobago?
Very challenging question, and I really didn't give you any story about the creative parenting for the new era. We got funding, let me say then, that we got funding of 1.7 million in 2001 with specific mission to develop, test the curriculum, and disseminate parenting education across Trinidad and Tobago. And we systematically pursued that mission, one by hosting a series of consultations with the existing non-governmental organizations and hearing what they thought parenting education was, and then recognizing that for some of these organizations, parenting education was one lecture whenever about a topic at a school, because they didn't have any curriculum that was clearly tested and defined, because they didn't have the personnel to deliver it. And so it was, even though everybody was boasting that they were teaching parenting education, what was offered was very questioned. And many times it was a lecture, top-down format, not participatory. Nor was it empowering to people who were there. So you would hear people saying, well, I went to PTA meeting and it was boring. We set out from the beginning to first ask people what the issues were. And we collected those issues. We also collected their interpretation, how they felt about what was going on, their interpretation of the state of things in parenting in Trinidad. And we asked school children. We have something from the girls from St. Joseph's Convent. We had reports from infants in infant school, what they thought was happening with their parents. We had the response from professionals in the, so we started in a very disciplined kind of way, collecting the data, and we have it written up. Then we collected a number of specialists in different fields, and they made their inputs in terms of education, health, emotional development, psychology, the whole works practices in the different fields. We found that, so we were on a research focus at that stage, fact finding, and we found that it was, in order to, some of the things we found that were important to us, one is that there was agreement across the board that there was need for parenting education, that a lot of people were parenting under a great deal of stress, that their people were repeating patterns that they had learned without questioning. There was an unconscious kind of parenting. We had a number of there was need for healing. There was need for physical, a spiritual and a philosophical position to be taken about what kind of children do we want to bring into, to rear in this country? What kind of people are we aiming to make? And I think that allowed us to develop a curriculum that was both participatory, in that we constantly got feedback from the people we trained. And we trained in groups of 25 selected people who we thought were strategically located in the systems. Like if you're in a school, if you're in a church group, if you're in an NGO group, if you, whatever area where you have influence. So if you're a principal, and then you have a staff of 100, and you have teachers who are facing 30, 40 children at a time, if they could buy into philosophy of respect and understanding of both themselves and the people they are responding to, the needs of families in communities, the impact of poverty, of mental illness, of all the other things, if we could bring together, and if we can use an approach that respected the wisdom and the experiences of people, we would stand a better chance of being relevant. And so we did evaluate every training program. We had a list of questions, both in terms of how do you, quantitative and qualitative, how do you rate the presenter, and you could good, bad, indifferent, if you know, but, and what the content of the program, the organization of the program, and then how did it impact on you, how did you feel, what did you learn, what are you committed to do as a result. Okay, so we have had standard questionnaire, which is very exciting because we meet the most ordinary people and we find them so wise and so beautiful and so passionate in but we have had the privilege of having enough money when we started to put people through programs that were between 3 weekends from Friday to Sunday, would be 3 to 9 or even sometimes 4, and in residential settings. So we were really doing something very serious, and as we reported to our funders, they kept on sending us money, so that the evidence of the worth of our effort was based on both the fact that our funders agreed that we were doing something important, let's continue to do it, until they had changes in their staff and their philosophy. So I'm talking too long, but that's what I said. I can't describe what I'm doing.
Can I hear the question again, please? The Port of Spain branch, isn't involved in monetary programs per se. The branches that I will talk about will be the Barrett area, San Fernando, and what's the other branch? Separia branches. They are involved in the giving out of the school feeding program, and they are closely monitored by the government agencies. One of their complaints being that they seem to shift what they require of them very often. So they almost make it impossible for them to keep up with whatever. It is very difficult for them. In addition, they have day nurseries, through which they have to follow, again, a lot of stipulations put forth by the government, and that too sometimes can be a strain. Now, one of the things on the coterie of the whole, in the past we used to get government subventions to help us to run the coterie. Now, they say that we are income earners because we have property, because we have a hostel and whatever it is, so they have taken away the government subventions from us.
Hi, good day. I have several questions. So first I'll start with the main one. That's for, first I'll start with the main one for the whole panel. In the face of issues such as funding, fiscal and legal frameworks, as you stated, all NGOs' main priority is to promote social development, right? So is it feasible to have a organized universal NGOs to decrease the issues that are faced with these NGOs?
Would you like to just give all your questions, or you prefer me to prefer that we answer one at a time? Okay, cool. So you're making a very important point. This case has been made for how many years? To have an umbrella body of NGOs. The latest version of this actually came out of the establishment of the Civil Society Board, where the government actually had held elections and encouraged persons to register with them in order to establish a mechanism of sorts for policy creation, right? In the first instance, civil society is independent. It's not accountable to government. So I want to also mention that little disclaimer there. So where government wanted civil society to register, civil society decided, hey, why not go along with this process? Initially, there were a number of larger organizations who said no. But in the end, these organizations came together, registered with the then Ministry of National Diversity and Social Integration, I think it was called. Elections were held. The voter turnout was quite low. All of this is actually in this document that's going to be publicly available within next week. Nothing went forward from the ministry. The minister actually came out and said he was disappointed about the entire process. And so nothing went forward. Civil society then felt, those groups that were involved, decided that, you know what, they still have to organize themselves. And they formed, the most recent thing is the Association of Civil Society Organizations of Trinidad and Tobago, ASOT. And they're now arranging, I know that they recently registered, they're trying to get a bank account, and this is as an umbrella group. In terms of the legal and fiscal framework, again, this document I have before me is in fact a document that was produced by a number of civil society organizations who are interested in changing the existing tax legislation. And a meeting was held about 2 weeks ago at UNDP's office down the road, somewhere around here actually, in order to come to some kind of resolution. Legislative change, as you know, is quite difficult, but there are models such as the Belizean model. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has NGO legislation specific to civil society organizations. So it's not a situation where civil society is not trying to organize itself. It has, over the past 20 plus years, proven to be quite difficult because civil society in and of itself is diverse. And then there are also personalities, huge personalities. And I'll leave it as that.